Wilhelm Franz Canaris had spent most of his life in the service of the sea, yet it was not the waves that shaped his destiny, but the shadows that moved beneath the surface of nations. Born on the first morning of 1887 in the quiet town of Applerbeck, he grew up far from the thunder of politics or the weight of empires. His childhood had been ordinary: strict schooling, demanding teachers, and a fascination with stories of explorers and intelligence officers. But within him, even as a boy, there was a natural instinct to observe rather than speak, to analyse rather than react. Those qualities would later turn him into one of the most enigmatic figures of the 20th century. At 17, he entered the Imperial German Navy. It was a world of cold metal, rigid discipline, and strict hierarchy, yet Canaris adapted easily. He was quick-minded, fluent in several languages, and possessed a remarkable memory for details: ships, routes, codes, names. His commanders noticed this, and by the time the First World War erupted, he was already viewed as an officer capable of more than simply commanding a deck. His first encounter with real intelligence work came in 1915, when he served aboard the SMS Dresden, a light cruiser operating in the Atlantic and later the Pacific. When the ship was forced into Chilean waters and eventually scuttled to avoid capture by the British, many assumed its officers would fade into captivity. But not Canaris. Using forged documents and the help of local contacts, he escaped Chile, crossed South America, and found his way back to Germany through Spain. The feat placed him firmly in the unofficial ranks of Germany's most promising intelligence minds. After the war, the Treaty of Versailles restricted Germany's military might, but it did not erase the need for intelligence. Canaris quietly entered the world of clandestine operations. He built networks, recruited informants, and maintained contacts in Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy. He learned that wars were often decided long before armies marched, decided in coded messages, secret meetings, and carefully planted rumours. By the early 1930s, he had become a respected, if mysterious, figure within Germany's intelligence circles. Then came a turning point that neither he nor the world could ignore: the rise of Adolf Hitler. Canaris watched the rapid transformation of Germany with the cautious eyes of a man who understood power far too well. Hitler's speeches were filled with fury and promise, and his followers were driven by absolute devotion. But behind the public enthusiasm, Canaris sensed danger. He recognized in Hitler a man who saw enemies everywhere and who believed violence could solve every political problem. The new regime demanded absolute loyalty, yet Canaris felt that loyalty to one man was far more dangerous than loyalty to a nation. In 1935, he was appointed the head of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. Many believed he would carry out Hitler's will without question, but Canaris approached the role with a mixture of professionalism and skepticism. To him, the Abwehr was not a tool for political terror, but a structure for gathering information, protecting Germany's security, and maintaining balance in a rapidly shifting Europe. He strengthened the department, expanded its foreign networks, and recruited individuals who could think independently, an unusual trait in a regime built on obedience. From the beginning, he found himself walking a fragile line. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, distrusted the Abwehr. They considered it too traditional, too independent, too unpredictable. The rivalry grew slowly at first. Questions during meetings, sudden checks on operations, quiet warnings. But Canaris remained calm. He had learned long ago that survival in intelligence was not about strength, but about subtlety. He gathered information not only about foreign powers, but about the internal workings of the Nazi regime itself. Knowledge, he believed, was the only protection. As Germany moved toward war, Canaris's doubts deepened. He met diplomats who warned him that Hitler's ambitions would lead to catastrophe. He read reports from agents who described the growing persecution of Jews and political dissidents. He understood that Germany was preparing for a conflict unlike any before. Yet outwardly he stayed loyal, or at least appeared to be. His position required it, his department needed it, and the men who relied on him could not afford a public confrontation with the regime. But beneath the surface, his thoughts were changing. He began quietly helping individuals escape persecution, small actions at first, but significant. He used Abwehr funds to provide false identities. He assigned certain officers to tasks that would conveniently place them far from the SS. He learned to cloak his intentions behind the daily bureaucracy of intelligence work. He also developed relationships with foreign intelligence officers, especially those in Britain and Spain. Officially, these were contacts required for the Abwehr's mission. Unofficially, they became channels for caution. Canaris did not openly betray his country, but he sought to prevent a war he believed would destroy it. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the conflict he had feared was no longer avoidable. Canaris watched as the country cheered the early victories. The military believed the Abwehr would now become a powerful force, gathering intelligence for conquest. But Canaris understood something most did not. Every victory through terror carried within it the seeds of future ruin. As the war expanded across Europe, he found himself playing two roles, publicly supporting the regime he privately opposed, while slowly, carefully, weaving a network of individuals who shared his belief that Hitler must be stopped. It was a dangerous dance, one that required precision, courage, and the ability to hide his true intentions from a government built on suspicion. This was the beginning of a path that would lead to one of the darkest yet most daring chapters of his life, a path that would make him both a servant of the German Reich and a secret architect of resistance. The early years of the war transformed Wilhelm Canaris from a cautious observer into a man forced to confront the very machinery he served. Though he remained the official head of the Abwehr, the growing power of the SS shadowed his every move. Himmler and his ambitious deputy Reinhard Heydrich believed that all intelligence should fall under their control. To them, the Abwehr was not only outdated, it was disloyal. Canaris understood the danger. He watched as the SS expanded its influence across occupied Europe, setting up its own networks, conducting its own interrogations, and delivering its own justice. Yet he maintained a quiet, almost serene demeanour. A man who panics never survived long in intelligence work. He continued holding briefings, signing reports, and managing operations, all while carefully concealing that he was beginning to oppose the regime from within. In 1940, after Germany overran France in just 6 weeks, the mood in Berlin was triumphant. But Canaris was troubled. During a visit to Paris that autumn, he saw firsthand the implications of Hitler's occupation policies. He observed the confiscations, the arrests, the fear that seeped into ordinary life. For him, victory did not look like glory, it looked like instability. It looked like the beginning of something Germany could never sustain. He returned to Berlin more certain than ever that Hitler's war would lead to ruin, and he knew that his own role was growing more dangerous. Inside the Abwehr, he began quietly reorganizing his most trusted officers. Some of them, Hans Oster, Hans von Dohnanyi, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, believed wholeheartedly that Hitler must be removed. Others simply opposed the brutality of the regime. Canaris never gave them direct orders to resist, but he created an environment in which they could work, speak, and plan without immediate fear of discovery. It was during this period that the Abwehr became a subtle but critical hub for anti-Nazi sentiment within the military. Meetings were disguised as routine intelligence briefings. Messages were hidden within classified reports. Even travel orders, signed by Canaris himself, allowed dissidents to move across Germany under the guise of official business. One of the most significant operations Canaris oversaw during this time involved aiding Jews and political prisoners to escape Germany. Operating through Spain and Switzerland, he coordinated false documents, travel routes, and safe houses. He never discussed these actions openly, and he destroyed most written evidence, but his influence was unmistakable. For someone who officially served the Reich, the risk was extraordinary. In early 1942, Canaris received intelligence that shook him profoundly. The Abwehr had intercepted reports from the Eastern Front describing mass killings of civilians by SS units. These were not battlefield casualties, they were targeted massacres carried out in towns and villages. Canaris read the reports in silence, then ordered his officers to verify the information. When confirmation arrived, he realized the regime had crossed a line from which there was no return. He carried the documents to General Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the High Command. Keitel dismissed the information with a cold shrug, calling it military necessity. Canaris walked out of the office with a sense of finality. If the highest military leaders condoned these actions, there was no chance the regime could be saved from its own brutality. It was at this point that he became more directly involved in efforts to warn foreign powers about Hitler's intentions. During secret meetings in Spain, he hinted to British contacts that the war could be shortened if Germany's leadership fractured from within. He never revealed concrete plans, but he made sure they understood that not all of Germany supported Hitler's vision. Whether the British believed him or not remained uncertain. In war, trust was always scarce. By mid-1942, the internal conflict between the Abwehr and the SS intensified. Heydrich was assassinated in Prague, and Himmler searched desperately for enemies within. The Abwehr became a convenient target. Heydrich's successors accused Canaris of incompetence, sabotage, and disloyalty. Though none of the accusations were proven, the pressure grew relentless. Then came a moment that changed the balance of power, the failure at Stalingrad. The defeat shattered the illusion of German invincibility. For Canaris, it confirmed what he had long feared. The war was lost in spirit, if not yet on paper. The resistance within the military gained new urgency. Discussions of removing Hitler shifted from theoretical to practical. Plans were drafted, rejected, revised, and discussed again. Bombs were built, timetables were set. Canaris knew of many of these plans. He did not always approve them, believing some were reckless or poorly timed. But he ensured that those involved had the freedom to operate. His office became a shelter, his signature a shield. Yet he remained haunted by one question. Could he truly oppose a regime he still officially served without destroying everything he stood for? Deception was his profession, but this deception carried a moral weight unlike anything he had ever known. Every action, every forged passport, every secret meeting, every coded message placed him one step closer to discovery. In 1943, the war turned decisively against Germany. The Allies advanced in North Africa, Italy fell, and the Soviet Union pushed west. Hitler's paranoia deepened. He demanded absolute loyalty from his officers and executed those who disappointed him. Under such pressure, even minor suspicions became deadly. The SS launched a major investigation into the Abwehr. Offices were searched, files seized, and personnel interrogated. Canaris stood calmly through it all, answering questions with precision, providing documents, and insisting that any failures were due to the chaos of war, not disloyalty. For a time, he survived through sheer skill and patience, but he knew the walls were closing in. The resistance within Germany reached a critical stage in late 1943 and early 1944. Plans to assassinate Hitler were now underway with increasing frequency. Canaris observed these efforts with a quiet and almost fatalistic understanding. Each attempt was more desperate than the last, and each failure pushed the conspirators closer to exposure. Still, he continued, his belief had hardened. The regime must fall, or Germany would be destroyed. This period became the most dangerous chapter of his life, a time when he stood at the centre of a storm that could sweep him away at any moment. It was a path that could end only two ways, in the unlikely success of the conspiracy or in the collapse of everything he had built. And as 1944 approached, it became clear which of these futures was drawing closer. By the beginning of 1944, Wilhelm Canaris stood on the edge of a precipice he could no longer step back from. The war was turning into a catastrophe for Germany, and resistance inside the country felt the pressure of urgency like never before. Plans to remove Hitler, once cautious and theoretical, were now desperate. Bombs were built, uniforms prepared, and couriers sent racing across Europe with coded messages. Canaris sensed that the window of opportunity was closing, yet he continued to navigate the situation with the discipline of a man accustomed to danger. In February 1944, the Abwehr officially lost much of its authority. Its responsibilities were transferred to the SS Intelligence Service, the RSHA. It was a direct blow to Canaris. His department was slowly being dismantled, his officers reassigned, and his influence reduced to a shadow of what it had once been. He understood the meaning clearly. Himmler no longer wanted the Abwehr to exist, and he no longer wanted Canaris anywhere near the centres of power. Yet Canaris appeared calm. He withdrew quietly, avoided political clashes, and focused on protecting as many of his officers as he could. He arranged transfers, wrote recommendations, and used the remnants of his authority to shield those who had assisted the resistance. But he also understood that his protection was temporary. Every day brought new interrogations, new rumours, new searches. The SS was tightening its net. Then came the turning point, the 20th of July, 1944. Members of the resistance, many of them directly or indirectly connected to Canaris, attempted a bold plan to assassinate Hitler during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair. A bomb was placed under the conference table. It detonated, but Hitler survived the blast. For the conspirators, failure was immediate. For Canaris, even though he was not present and had no direct role in the operation, the consequences were inevitable. News of the failed assassination reached Berlin within hours. The SS moved fast, arresting military officers, government officials, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. Canaris received no summons at first, but he knew the moment would come. He returned to his desk, reviewed his papers, and began quietly removing anything that might endanger others. But he did not flee. He had spent years serving his country in ways that were often invisible, often dangerous. Now he faced the consequences of those choices with the reserved dignity of a man who understood the price. Days later, the SS arrived. He was taken into custody in early 1944 and placed under house arrest, then transferred to prison facilities. The interrogations began almost immediately. Canaris answered with caution and clarity, never admitting to direct involvement, never revealing names. But the SS already possessed fragments, letters, testimonies, small clues built up over years of suspicion. Still, nothing they had was enough for a formal conviction. Then, by chance, they found what they needed. Near the end of 1944, during a routine search of Abwehr offices, investigators discovered a diary Canaris had kept secretly. It contained reflections on the regime, private criticisms, and references to individuals he had quietly helped. It was not a blueprint of conspiracy, but it was enough to confirm to the SS that he'd been an enemy of the regime for years. That discovery sealed his fate. The war, meanwhile, was collapsing around Germany. Cities were bombed daily. Armies on the eastern and western fronts were retreating. The leadership was desperate, angry, and increasingly isolated. In such an atmosphere, clemency was impossible. In early 1945, Canaris was moved to Flossenbürg, a concentration camp where many political prisoners were held. His appearance had changed, his once neat uniform replaced by plain prison clothing, his usually precise posture weakened by confinement. Yet despite the harsh conditions, survivors later recalled that he remained composed, still speaking with the calm, measured voice that had defined him throughout his career. Even at the end, he asked about the fate of his officers, concerned more for others than for himself. In April 1945, with Allied forces only days away from liberating the region, the Nazi leadership ordered a final round of punishments against those connected to the 20th of July plot. Canaris' name was on the list. There was no trial in any meaningful sense. The decision had already been made. He was executed at the camp shortly before the war in Europe came to an end. His death was quiet, lacking ceremony, witnessed by only a few, but its significance would echo far beyond the walls of the camp. When the war ended weeks later and Germany lay in ruins, stories of Canaris' secret actions began to surface. Former officers, diplomats, and rescued individuals revealed how he had used his position to help those in danger, undermine the most brutal orders, and provide quiet channels of resistance. Some regarded him as a hero who had tried to save Germany from itself. Others criticized him for remaining within the system too long, but almost all agreed that he was one of the most complex figures of the era, a man who navigated the darkness of dictatorship with caution, contradiction, and at times remarkable courage. Historians would later debate his motivations. Was he driven by patriotism, morality, a sense of duty? Or was it simply the instinct of a man who had seen too much destruction and believed he had a responsibility to reduce it? The answer was likely a mixture of all these things. What remained undeniable was that Wilhelm Canaris lived and died in the shadows, serving a country he believed in while resisting a regime he considered destructive. He was both an insider and an outsider, a loyal officer and a quiet dissident. His life was shaped not by open declarations, but by silent decisions, subtle risks, and actions that often went unrecognized. In the end, his story is not only about one man, but about the countless choices individuals face in times of tyranny. Choices that define courage, not in grand gestures, but in quiet, sometimes hidden acts of conscience. And though he never lived to see the world beyond the war, history would remember him as one of the rare figures who opposed evil from within its walls, guided not by certainty, but by a steady, persistent belief that even in darkness, there must be limits to what one allows.